I want to talk about the role of very detailed soil environment maps in assessing the performance of buried water pipes. I want to make three main points. First, for a system-wide understanding of asset performance, the holy grail of a recipe that defines soil corrosivity is unnecessary. Second, I'm going to turn soil corrosivity tradition on its head, and I'm going to show you that you can relate assets and asset failures to a soil map and then train that map to represent asset performance. The thing is that the more detailed the soil map, the more detailed the reporting of asset performance will be. You don't need this, you need this. My third point is that a very detailed soil environment map can be GIS modelled, and then it can be used to understand buried asset performance proactively to inform the design of pressure management zones, reactively to assign leak detection resources to areas based on recent weather conditions, and we're going to see how weather relates to asset performance, and retrospectively to assign leak detection resources to areas based on long-term weather conditions. This is a paper that I presented at the 5th World Congress on Engineering Asset Management in 2010. And here's the link to the actual paper itself. And of course, this is the reference. My name's Ian Allen. I'm Principal Consultant of Geocode. I also have a teaching arm to my business, which is a website called gis-university.com. At the time I presented this paper, I was a Senior Associate at RMIT University. I've also been a Senior Associate at Monash University in Clayton. My research focus over the years has been on the role of detailed soil mapping in on-site wastewater compliance modelling, buried asset performance modelling, conflict resolution and conflict avoidance. Over the years, I've been contracted by the UN and Australian federal, state and local governments, as well as various government businesses on projects as diverse as buried asset performance, housing affordability modelling, site selection studies for post-tsunami Banda Aceh. I was one of a 3-person panel who reviewed proposals for the first iteration of the National Broadband Contract, and of course the on-site wastewater compliance modelling. My approach to this problem of buried reticulation asset performance is different from that you'd find from a statistician, a mathematician or an engineer or many other sorts of professions. I am a geographer, and so my particular interest is understanding asset performance patterns at different spatial scales and different temporal scales. So I want to start out with a review of historical approaches, in particular the DIPRA scheme for understanding soil corrosivity. And then I want to talk about taking a different approach to understanding buried asset performance using these very detailed soil environment maps. So in 2003, Geocode and CSIRO applied the DIPRA scoring system to Yarra Valley Water's assets. With this system, when a soil environment has a final score of greater than 10, then it is considered to be corrosive. So there's an implied need for site-by-site soil testing here, although as you'll see we did apply this quantitatively to most of Yarra Valley Water's assets. So here, with any one of these soil characteristics, where the score is greater than, or 10 or greater, that soil is deemed to be corrosive. So there's a resistivity component, a pH component, a redox potential component, sulfides and soil moisture. So here's the map that we applied this to quantitatively. There are many different soil types. It's actually a terrain pattern map, which is a bit different than a soil map, but for our purposes, let's call it a soil map. Here's the DIPRA scoring system applied to the Yarra Valley Water soil map. The DIPRA scores were applied by Dr. Robert van der Graaf, who is a very senior soil scientist. Those soil polygons that are shaded red have a DIPRA score of 10 or greater, and so the DIPRA scoring system would say that a cast iron asset would perform poorly in these areas. And the map turns out to be a fairly reasonable reflection of how our assets actually do perform in the Yarra Valley water area. So let's actually look at how these assets perform. Now I'm going to talk about this particular map in more detail later in the talk, but for the sake of comparison, here's a map of the actual performance of Yarra Valley Water's cast iron reticulation assets that were installed in the 1950s. Now remember, I was saying that this area in the west would be expected to perform poorly according to the DIPRA map, and it sort of does, although we can see this poorly performing area extends a bit to the east. The DIPRA map would also have most of this area as performing uniformly. But there are problems with the DIPRA scheme. The first is, even though we did imply that quantitatively in those last slides, the implication is that there is a need for site level testing. Doyle and colleagues say in their paper that although the DIPRA scheme correctly predicted soils to be corrosive in 91% of cases that they researched, it correctly predicted soils to be non-corrosive in only 38% of cases. So in other words, around 9 in 10 pipes that should have been getting protection at the time of burial were getting it. But in contrast, around 6 in 10 pipes that didn't need protection at the time of burial were still getting it. Okay, so I think that Doyle's work shows that an asset manager's suspicion that an asset needs protection might actually be just as effective as applying the DIPRA test. To be honest, it is my suspicion that one of the missing pieces in the buried asset performance puzzle is that the DIPRA scoring system lacks a climate component. In other words, it's my suspicion that the local soil environment, including soil chemistry, predisposes an asset to perform poorly, but it's local climate and local weather that precipitates the poor performance. And we're going to see this roll out in later slides. So there are problems with existing approaches. Other attempts at relating soil corrosivity maps to buried assets have been undermined by a lack of understanding of the nature of soil maps. So in other words, soils do not occur in ways that engineers and GIS folk would like them to. Boundaries between soil types are often diffuse rather than discrete. So soils have tended to move to the too hard basket for many people interested in asset management. There has been continued search for a soil corrosivity recipe. I want to propose a change of paradigm and focus. What I think we should be doing is using traditional soil mapping techniques and value adding these with GIS modelling. Using this technique, the focus is no longer on the soil environments themselves, but rather it's on the performance of assets within the soil environments. And this means that there is no longer a need to search for a soil corrosivity recipe. So let's take this idea a bit further by applying it to some of Yarra Valley Water's assets, in particular their cast iron cement lined assets, which represent around about half of Yarra Valley Water's assets, 4,365 kilometres to be exact, mostly installed in the 1920s, 1950s, 1960s and 1970s. Yarra Valley Water has numerous types of assets that were laid in different places at different points in time. So even seemingly identical assets may have been manufactured using different techniques, at different ages, and are certainly in different soil environments. They can therefore be expected to perform differently, and for analytical purposes should be grouped in ways that reflect their differences where it's possible to do that. So one type of grouping that assets lend themselves to is decade of installation, and that's what we're going to pursue from now on. So my in-house software that I call CatchMap 2008 can analyse asset failures at terrain pattern scale. Okay, that's these soil polygons that we saw in the soil map. Now this slide and the next two slides demonstrate that failure rates are affected by asset age. The coloration of the map represent asset failure classes in terms of failures per 10 kilometres per year. Now the classes are 0 to just less than 2, 2 to just less than 4 failures per 10 kilometres per year, 4 to less than 6, 6 to 8, 8 to less than 10, and greater than 10 failures per 10 kilometres per year. Now there is a balancing act with this sort of analysis because by breaking assets into groupings that are too small, sometimes the results can be misleading. In this case, cast iron or CICL assets have been segregated by decade of installation and terrain pattern. It is especially important to separate assets laid in the 1970s and beyond because the soil environments change at this point because of the use of granular backfill became routine. Here's the 1970s cast iron assets, 1960s cast iron assets. We're starting to get fairly high failure rates in the west, and even more red appears in this map of 1950s cast iron assets. The implication, of course, is that in a decade's time, 1960s assets can be expected to be performing similarly to this. Let's now talk about the nature of soil maps, because it's pretty important to understanding how all this is going to unfold. Unless soil maps are very detailed, the soils within the maps will vary according to local terrain. In other words, in the absence of large-scale, very expensive, very detailed soil mapping exercise, soil boundaries are going to incorporate units of soil, but the problem is that assets can be expected to perform differently in each soil unit. So let's just look at a typical example here. Here's one soil boundary, but when we actually look at the block diagram of what's going on in that soil boundary, we see that there's 3 terrain units or 3 subsets of the soils. Soils on the upper slopes that you can expect to be have shallower profiles, probably have rock closer to the surface and so forth. Mid slope, where we can expect soil to have progressed down the slope over time. So those profiles will be a little bit thicker. More than likely the soils will be fairly well drained, but when we get to the bottom of the slope in these areas, we can expect that the soils will be quite thick or quite deep. They'll be a lot wetter because they've got all this rainfall or water that's progressing down the slope that's moving into it. So we can expect different sorts of chemistry going on, different textures going on, and different profiles. So if we're going to analyse asset performance using soils, the analyses are going to be most useful when they're undertaken at the terrain unit scale. But terrain units, or those very small pockets within the actual soils themselves, I'm referring to the upper, mid, lower slope, but in the previous diagram, but of course far more complex, in more complex terrain, these small units of soil are going to be very expensive and very time consuming to interpret using traditional methods. So here's the interesting thing I was able to do. By relating asset failures to GIS, aspect maps and slope maps, I was able to devise combinations of aspect and slope that were important to buried asset performance. I was able to then synthesize these into some combinations and create 5 divisions within each terrain pattern boundary in that 1:25,000 scale soil map that we were looking at earlier. I call these divisions very detailed soil environments. These soil environments that are so detailed that around 800 soil polygons in that map became around about 250,000 very detailed soil environments. So we're talking about a 300-fold increase in soil map detail. So we're looking at turning this map here into this map here. The map creation process was an absolutely enormous GIS processing task. Aside from the research that went into defining what they were, the processing was an enormous task too. We see the patterns overlaid in black. The blue colours represent flatter terrain and the reds represent steeper terrain. The model uses a contour-derived terrain model, so a far superior result could be expected using LiDAR data. In the insets, Yarra Valley water assets are overlaid in green. And note that the assets are often within more than one terrain unit. So the majority of Yarra Valley water assets are within this pilot area. And remember, just as a reminder, we're no longer interested in whether a soil is corrosive or not. What we're interested in is only how an asset performs within each very detailed soil environment. So what we're about to look at is analysis of very detailed soil environments within 6 of the 1:25,000 soil types. What you will see is that age grouping is significant. So in other words, older assets always fail at higher rates than younger assets. While in aggregate, there appears to be only a minor trend for failure rates to relate to the very detailed soil environments. When we disaggregate this data, asset performance can be seen to be responsive to weather. Before looking at the very detailed soil environments in detail, let's have a look at this relationship between rainfall, between season, and between failure rates. Rainfall in this case is taken from Melbourne Airport and is related on a monthly basis to CICL asset failures between December 2005 and June 2003. Rainfall is in blue and asset failures in pink. Summer months are underlined with a yellow bar. It is even more complex than what I'm about to say, but as a rule of thumb, what I think this graph shows is where you have 2 consecutive summer months where rainfall is less than 40 millimetres, you can expect a dramatic decrease in asset performance. And a rain event with a little bit of lag reverses this trend. Taking into account my earlier comment that the missing component in the DIPRA scoring system was climate, of course the more closely soil boundaries reflect rainfall zones, the better the delineation of asset performance regions is going to be. The 6 soils or terrain patterns that we're going to be looking at in the following slides can be seen in the table on the left. They are ordered from best performing to worst performing. Lumping of data masks the effect of age. So on average, the 52.009-011 assets perform at 9.97 failures per 10 kilometres per year. However, when we disaggregate this, the assets installed in the 1970s perform at 4.31 failures per 10 kilometre per year, while assets installed in the 1950s perform at 15.79 failures per 10 kilometres per year. At very detailed soil environment scale, within the decade of installation groupings, it appears as though that there is little difference in overall performance between the very detailed soil environments. However, The following slides demonstrate that this way of aggregating data masks the variability of asset performance within terrain patterns or soils in response to fluctuating short-term climatic conditions. In other words, assets in different very detailed soil environments fail at different rates in different climate conditions. And not all terrain pattern VDSE combinations respond in the same way at the same time. And we'll see how all this pans out in the next series of slides. This series of slides shows that the assets in each terrain pattern, terrain unit combination respond to climate, particularly rainfall, in a unique way. In other words, there will be times when failure rates in some very detailed soil environments are very high, and others when the failure rates are very low. And I suspect there's a bit of potential to use this understanding to allocate leakage detection resources more effectively and more responsively. I want to just talk you through these columns. Here's the date. The first column is the date in terms of month and year. We have rainfall classes down here. The lighter the blue, the lower the rainfall, the higher the darker the blue, the higher the rainfall. We have temperature. The yellows are lower temperatures and the reds are higher temperatures. And then we have the failure rate in each of the VDSEs, so the very detailed soil environments. So soil environment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay, in terms of failure rates per 10 kilometres per year. The greys with virtually no failures, and the moving up to the dark browns where there's a high failure. Earlier in the talk I mentioned two regimes of leak detection, reactive and retrospective. The following slides represents potential to deal with both of these. The three columns of data show on a month-to-month basis that there is a relationship between short-term climate conditions and variable failure rates in each terrain pattern / VDSE combination. Following this set of slides, I'm going to map this table. On a month-to-month basis, these data could form the basis for a reactive response to leak detection. When we move back and forth within this slide series a couple of times, it is obvious that cast iron assets respond differently to different soil environments at different times. This has implications for leak detection resource allocation. This table here is a historic summary of the three columns. It's a simple count of the number of months that each VDSE has hosted very high failure rates and forms the basis for a retrospective leak detection strategy. In other words, a terrain unit hosting many months of high failure rates is probably more likely to have leaking assets than a terrain unit that has hosted only a few months of failure rates. And I suppose it also has implications for defining proactive pressure management zones. But so what we're looking at here is we're looking at 5.1 kilometres of assets that have had this 12 instances of greater than 15 failures per 10 kilometres per year. Okay, so it's going to be far more economical to look at a small portion of your assets rather than a large portion. So in some terrain patterns, it becomes even more obvious how useful this sort of information can be. Thirdly, the chart shows the aggregate performance of assets installed in the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s and gives an impression of asset performance as they age. Note that in some slides, asset performance within the very detailed soil environments seems to level off between the 1960s and 1950s. In other slides, there is an obvious trend that suggests asset performance decline. The performance shown in this series of charts would look different if renewals were incorporated. So for example, for 1950s assets in very detailed soil environments associated with better performance, renewals tended to be around 5%. However, in the worst performing very detailed soil environments, renewals exceeded 17%. So the renewals are actually affecting the shape of the graph. All right, but let's go through them. So we're looking at the cast iron assets in this terrain pattern 51.009-021. So let's move from the best performing to the worst performing again. Okay, we can see, like in this slide here, there's a bunch of months where terrain units 3, 4 and 5 have a fair bit of stuff going on in them. Okay, and for example, in terrain unit 5, there's 34 kilometres of the total 110 kilometre length of assets. So this sort of information potentially could give you focus. You might want to move back and forward in this video to try and understand these graphs a little bit better. Okay, here's these same charts mapped. Okay, so these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 soil types or terrain patterns with terrain units mapped according to asset performance. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at November 2000. We've had a total rainfall in November of 38 mils and the average temperature has been 18 degrees. Total rainfall in December, 18 mils. It's starting to dry out. We can see that the assets are failing at higher rates. The assets, of course, or the failures, are the green. You can see them as green dots. And as we move into January, rainfall decreases, average temperature increases. We've got a drying out of the soils and failures increase. February, March, and we've had high rainfall this month, and watch next month, it drops. Okay? And the same sort of thing occurs in other months too. All right, so you might want to see these again. I'll just quickly run through those again. Okay, temperature and rainfall and month up here. And of course, as more red appears, the failure rates are increasing. So very quickly, I want to show you these three maps that are within one terrain pattern in one area. We're looking at the graph here, mapped here. So decade of installation, we've got 1970s assets here. So once again, the more red the areas, the greater the failure rates. We've got the assets here. We can see these lines, and the failures over the analysis period are shown as green dots. Okay? So the implication of this, and it particularly applies to the 1960s assets versus the 1950s assets, is that in a decade's time, these 1960s installed assets, because they're installed in native soil rather than with granular backfill, will be expected to be performing in this manner here, okay, in these areas. So this sort of information, of course, can be used to give asset managers focus in the way that they manage their assets. Okay? So in summary, what I'm suggesting in this paper is that for a system-wide understanding of asset performance, you do not need a soil corrosivity recipe, okay? You only need to relate assets and asset failures to a soil map. And the more detailed that soil map is, and the more accurate that soil map is, the more accurate your reporting is going to be. Okay, I've been Ian Allen, and there's my contact details.